me to introduce you now?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for waiting. We just needed a few more minutes to get the live stream up, and we are ready to start momentarily with our guest speakers on Greenwood Cemetery. I know this is going to be good, and I know that you'll have questions at the end, so I'll run around the room and entertain questions for our guests.
Nick, are we good? Okay. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to I have the privilege of introducing our speakers today. They are Etta Daniels and Shelley Morris, and they've been doing a lot of historic work, preservation work at Greenwood Cemetery in North St. Louis County. And that is, I'll give them a chance to really talk about it, but Greenwood is an amazing historical resource right here in St. Louis. And I don't want to steal their thunder by talking about everything that's in there, but I just wanted to introduce them to you. Etta Daniels, who is this lovely lady wearing the hat up here. She will be up here shortly. She is one of the people who almost single-handedly saved Greenwood, so she's one of my heroes. She is a historian and archivist for Greenwood. And then we have Shelley Morris, who I've had the pleasure of volunteering with for our service learning project at Greenwood. She is the secretary of the Greenwood Preservation, and she is also a historian and archivist. And they're going to share some of the work that they've done and some of the stories that they've uncovered at Greenwood. And it's just a really amazing opportunity. So thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to them.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Shelley Morris, and I am the secretary and assistant historian, but I'm also the assistant groundskeeper as well. So I wear a lot of hats at Greenwood. I shall get started here. Let's see. It would help if I turned it on, right? There we go. Okay. When Greenwood Cemetery was established in 1874, let's see, is it kind of doing a little bit? Sorry. The nation was trying to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. Here in St. Louis, as in most of Missouri, freedom was formerly enslaved persons was met with resentment and resistance. After emancipation and before the establishment of Greenwood, most African Americans in this area did not have a choice of burial locations for their deceased members. Slavery was over, but from cradle to grave, segregation still assured most African Americans a separate and unequal status. I'm going to go back. Due to Jim Crow laws, customs in Potter's Fields and other city-owned cemeteries were the most frequent final resting places. Greenwood was explicitly established for the burial of Black people. Between 1874 and 1993, over 50,000 African Americans were buried in the 38.6 acres. Today, it has been reduced down to 31.85. So over time, they sold off some of the surrounding property. Greenwood, with its rural location, Victorian settings, and beautifully well-kept grounds, was a welcome change for the small but growing Black middle class of St. Louis. With the opening of the cemetery, they had access to a beautiful park-like setting where their ancestors could truly rest in peace. From the beginning, for the expanding Black community of St. Louis, Greenwood was a source of pride. For 29 years, Greenwood was the only Black commercial cemetery in the area. Funeral processions to Greenwood consisted of horse-drawn wagons and hired carriages that would slowly travel down St. Louis via the Rock Road. A typical burial cost during the early years ranged for $2.50 for children and $5 for adults. Over the years, actually over 100 years, Greenwood was a functioning and well-maintained burial ground. By mid-1970s, several factors converged to change the cemetery's fate. First, Greenwood had been owned and operated by one family since its establishment in 1874. Now in its fourth generation of ownership, family ownership, the younger people no longer wanted to be a part of the cemetery business. I mean, there were other options for them to go into. And cemetery work is very, very difficult work. Number two, Greenwood's infrastructure was starting to crumble. The roads were deteriorating, and it became more and more difficult for management to perform or pay for even routine maintenance, such as road repair or weed removal. Third, Greenwood was a business, and it was no longer making a profit. Greenwood was sold for the first time in 1983. And as you can see in this chart, you can see the decline. I'm sorry. You can see the decline. Let me see here. Oh, thank you. Like in 1940 to 1949, there was like over 3,000 burials. And by 1960 to 1969, of course, it was really quite profitable then. But over time, as the roads deteriorated, the grounds deteriorated, you can see that by 1993, there were very, very few burials happening at Greenwood Cemetery. And actually, in 1993, our last person to be buried was George Harris, and that was in the first part of the year. Local undertakers decided that due to the dangerous roads and the unkept conditions of the cemetery, they could no longer recommend the cemetery for their clients. For the descendants of the more than 50,000 people who had been buried at Greenwood between 1874 and 1993, the situation was not acceptable. Greenwood was not just a cemetery. Greenwood was the place where Mama and Daddy were buried. And as you can see, it became really quite deplorable. Great Aunt Sally, who raised me, Uncle John, who taught me how to drive. Those are the memories that people had in Greenwood. And for that, it was quite heartbreaking for them to try to visit their parents or their favorite aunt, and this is what they had to go through. So if you can imagine the heartbreak. In 1999, efforts to restore Greenwood and reclaim the history began with a grassroots organization called the Friends of Greenwood. And this is the symbol that they used, which is quite wonderful. And this was the old board, Friends of Greenwood. During its existence, the organization was able to clear a quarter of the grounds from the overgrowth. And also, one of the most important things they did was that they were able to get Greenwood placed on the National Register of Historic Places, and that happened in 2004. However, as time went on, many of those members have since either moved away or passed. And what the only remaining member was our historian, Etta Daniels. And yes, right there. And so today, and actually in 2016, Friends of Greenwood dissolved, and Etta agreed to be our historian and share her wonderful work with us, which was quite broad. And she'll talk about that a little more when she stands here before you. But the Friends of Greenwood, like I was saying, was established in 2016. We were able to be listed as St. Louis Historic Landmarks. And so we're quite proud of what we do. And all of our members here, they're all hardworking people. This gentleman here, who I get to call my husband, he's out there every day trying to make a difference with Greenwood. His name is Shelley Morris. So anytime you guys want to do some volunteer work, reach out to him and he will gladly tell you what needs to be done. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Etta Daniels, our historian. Etta has been with Greenwood. Well, she has family members there, but this body of work started back in 1999, and she has such a wealth of knowledge and history that she'd like to share with you.
Okay.
Ms. Daniels?
Now, you say that I don't need to do anything here?
No, just proceed on. Just click on. Just
click
keep
what?
clicking.
Oh,
There you
okay,
go.
all right. You all can tell that I am really computer savvy. Thank you so much for inviting us, first of all. We love to share the information about Greenwood, mostly to get people your age, people such as yourself, aware and hopefully involved in a project that is just amazing. As Greenwood's historian, I'm often asked, who are the famous people at Greenwood? There are very few well-known people at Greenwood, and Harriet Robinson Scott, just may be the most famous of all. I would imagine everyone in here knows who she was, but if you don't, I'm going to be telling you anyway. Most of the people buried at Greenwood are just ordinary, everyday folks, living ordinary, everyday lives. But what we find as we research the cemetery is that their stories help to give us a picture of real life in 19th and 20th century African American St. Louis. I would like to introduce you to a few folks. Most of the people that I'll be talking about here are unknown to anyone other than their family and friends, or were unknown to anyone other than their family and friends, but all of them have a story to tell about their time and their place in St. Louis, Missouri. This, of course, is Harriet Robinson Scott, wife of Dred Scott. Mrs. Scott, like most of those buried in the early years, had been born enslaved. We tend to think of Mrs. Scott in reference to the freedom suit filed by she and her husband. The suit went all the way to the Supreme Court before being denied, and that fact is national history, not just St. Louis local history. But in addition to being a claimant in what it's now, without doubt, the most important case ever heard by the Supreme Court, Greenwood reminds us that she was also wife, mother, and grandmother. When Harriet Scott died in 1876, and was buried at Greenwood. 4 months after she was buried, her grave was reopened, and her 2-day-old grandson, the child had died after living for 2 days, his name was Edward Madison. The grave was actually opened, and the baby was buried with his grandmother. This sounds strange to us today, but that was a very, very common practice at that point. When we go through the records, we see that all the time. Now, let's see if I can change. Oh, good. Unlike Mrs. Scott, Charlton Hunt Tandy was born free. He came to St. Louis in the 1850s to find work on the Mississippi River. Work for black men was menial but plentiful, and Tandy found many opportunities. Just before the Civil War began, Tandy was working at Jefferson Barracks as a waiter. During the war, he served as post messenger for the barracks. That helped him to develop political connections, and those connections would stand him in good stead for what would be a lengthy career of public service. His career would involve positions such as messenger at the U.S. Customs House, Deputy St. Louis City Collector, U.S. Land Agent, and Deputy U.S. Marshal in New Mexico and Oklahoma. His accomplishments were many. We couldn't even begin to talk about what Charlton Tandy actually did. Otherwise, we'd be here for a long time. In 1875, he founded an organization called the United Brothers of Friendship and Sisters of the Mysterious Ten. In 1894, he earned a law degree. He would also be the driving force behind the integration of St. Louis streetcars and equal education for black children. And I want to just go back and touch on some of those points. One of the things that we find as we work through various research projects at Greenwood is that the information that we find is directly related to circumstances that are occurring in the community at the time. For example, I mentioned he founded the United Brothers of Friendships and Sisters of the Mysterious Ten, something that I'm sure you never heard of. What that was a benevolent association. People would pay their quarters or 15 cents or whatever the stipulated amount was every week. And when they became ill or passed away, that money would be available to them to either use it just to stay alive or use it to have themselves buried. The integration of the St. Louis streetcars that I mentioned, in the late 1870s, St. Louis had streetcars. They weren't what we think of today. They were really large wagons, basically, pulled by horses, but it was public transportation. The thing was, black people were not allowed to use that public transportation. Or if they did, then we were obliged to stand outside on the railings. You couldn't you couldn't go inside the streetcar and sit down. You had to stand on the outside. Charlton Tandy was one of the people who insisted that system be changed, and insisted to the point that he physically confronted people attempting to prevent black people from using the streetcars. But I think Charlton's greatest accomplishments came in the area of education for black children. In the late 1870s, there were schools for black children. The first thing that you need to understand is that these schools were discriminated against from the very beginning. Instead of having names like whatever the school's name would or should be, they were given numbers. And there were no black teachers. All the teachers at this point had to be white. Tandy fought to have schools integrated, schools named, and black teachers employed to teach black children. One of the things that Charlton is best known for, though, came in 1879, when hundreds of men, women, and children attempting to escape violent conditions in the post-Civil War South started showing up on the St. Louis riverfront. I mean, literally just showing up on the St. Louis riverfront. They had dreams of new lives in Kansas. The reality was that they frequently arrived in St. Louis penniless, with the clothes on their backs, and with no assistance available to them, the black community had to take care of these people themselves. First of all, one of the problems was that all of a sudden there were beginning to be large numbers. I mean, sometimes the group showing up on the St. Louis riverfront would be as many as 300 people. People were getting to be very nervous. All of a sudden, all these black people were there. Nobody knew where they came from, why they came here, what they were going to do. The black community, for one thing, was afraid that they would be penalized for this influx of people. The only thing to do was to help them to move along on their journey to Kansas. These people were called exodusters. So if you ever have a project that you need to take a look at, exodusters, the exodusters movement in St. Louis is really fascinating. In an attempt to raise money for people coming to St. Louis, Tandy publicized the Exodus plight by speaking in New York and Boston. He also met with a man that you might have heard of, a man named Frederick Douglass, or he tried to meet with a man named Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass at that point was very influential in the entire United States as far as help him. One of the things that he said was this was just a country bumpkin and he didn't have any obligation to go and talk to this person. I mean, after all, this guy was from St. Louis. Whoever heard of St. Louis? So Frederick Douglass sort of dissed him, and Tandy had to go around. We all work around situations. When there's a roadblock, the thing to do is to try to figure out how to get around that roadblock. That's what Tandy did. Tandy was able to arrange a meeting with the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Harris, to discuss the situation in St. Louis. After that happened, Frederick Douglass, the mighty Frederick Douglass, sent him a note requesting a meeting with Tandy because Douglass wasn't able to get a meeting with the president. Tandy had been, so he had to sort of revise his opinion of a country bumpkin from St. Louis. Well, Tandy wasn't hearing any of that. No matter how important Frederick Douglass was, Tandy refused to meet with him, told him to go to the devil, and the legacy of Tandy's involvement with the St. Louis and national civil rights movement, and then we're still talking about the 1870s, not the 1960s, increased. Tandy's value increased. Tandy's reputation increased, giving people the idea that, well, maybe St. Louis was not as backwoods as people had been thinking. So, Charles Hunt Tandy is a pretty important person. We don't hear a whole lot about him anymore. There is a community center in North St. Louis that's named for him, but this is another research project that could just be fantastic. One of my things for many years has been that when Black History Month comes around and the teachers assign projects, normally you're talking about Dr. King or, someone that we have met on a national level. St. Louis has some amazing people, and I'm hoping that some of you will take a look at these people rather than the national folks. We don't have to go outside of our community to talk about civil rights and reactions to civil rights and civil rights progress. The St. Louis City, county, whatever, is really almost a focal point for these types of issues. St. Louis was definitely segregated. In fact, segregation is one of the reasons that Greenwood Cemetery exists at all. And changes in segregation, especially in hiring practices, came very slowly. But in 1873, Chauncey Philly, postmaster and former mayor of St. Louis, appointed the first Black letter carriers. They serviced mail routes in Black neighborhoods and were recognized as men of status within the Black community. I mean, after all, most Black men dug ditches and, did menial types of work. A letter carrier was a big deal in the Black community. James Madison Monroe Stokes was one of the earliest appointees and an early member of a community that can only be called a growing Black middle class. For over 42 years, Mr. Stokes was a member of the Central Baptist Church, and by all accounts, he was an active member, heavily involved in the community. He was a pioneer in terms of employment opportunities for African Americans in the late 19th century. He didn't just rest on his laurels and say, I've got mine. He made sure that other people, younger people, were getting opportunities for better types of employment. Next person I want to take a look at, and you won't be able to read this, that is I can't think of the name, but it might come to me in just a minute. Let me tell you about Charles Delaney while I'm trying to remember what the name of this document is. Charles Delaney died on December 18, 1880 of pneumonia in New York State. Within days of his death, his remains had been returned to St. Louis by river and taken to his parents' home at 12th and Morgan until the coroner could do the required inquest. Now that's what this is, a coroner's report. I think Charles died of pneumonia or something like that. It's interesting that that body was returned to St. Louis and returned to St. Louis so quickly, but he died in December, so the weather actually helped to preserve his body. Now, they brought that body home and they took it to his parents' house. There was nowhere else to take it. We're at a point that funeral homes really don't exist, and funerals were a lot of times just took place in the family home. So can you imagine your child, and I think Charles was in his 20s, your child goes away, and he's working. It's almost like when we go away to college and we come home. He went away to become a minstrel, and he had to be shipped home, but he came and he was shipped to his mother's house. The coroner, I understand, at that point was very busy. It was more than a week before he could get to the Delaney home in order to do the inquest. So now you think of a body of your only son laying in your living room for a week. This was a situation that just sort of seems out of place for us, but it was the way things were at that point. The inquest finally occurred on December 24th, on Christmas Eve, and on the following day, Charles Delaney, the youngest and last remaining child, they had 4 kids, 3 had already died, he was the last remaining child was laid to rest at Greenwood Cemetery. Now, just in what I've been talking about here, we've got some interesting information, and this is the kind of thing that Greenwood does. I mean, we picked up all of this information, but then we go back and say, well, why is it that this body was in the home? And then, we learn about burial customs of that time. Why is it that the inquest occurred on December 24th, and on the following day, December 25th, Christmas Day, this young man was buried? But then we have to think about the fact that embalming and things like that also did not exist. So all of these little bits and pieces are fitting together to make a picture of what life was like, things that we no longer deal with, so we really don't think about that much anymore. The group that Charles was with was a band, really, called the New Georgia Minstrels. It was a traveling tent show, and like I said, it was on one of their missions to, one of their gigs, I guess would be a good way to put it. On one of their gigs, he died. I can't imagine the horror of having a child's body lying in state in my living room. I also can't imagine having someone buried on what we now consider holidays, Christmas, New Year's, etc. None of those days were sacred as far as burials at any cemetery, and especially at Greenwood. Next person I want you to meet, actually. This is almost as if we're doing a virtual walking tour of Greenwood. This guy, Washington Reed, is one of the Civil War burials at Greenwood. Mr. Reed enlisted in the Union Army in 1863. He was mustered in as a private in Company G of the 14th Regiment of the Rhode Island Colored Heavy Artillery. The USCHA is the, I got this here. Let's see. Well, since I can't make it work. But anyway, USCHA is inscribed on, or carved into the bottom of that stone, and this stands for United States Colored Heavy Artillery. He was mustered in on November 4th, and he was promoted to sergeant on November 10th. And there was one specific reason, and it was because he could read and write. After an honorable discharge from the Army, Reed returned to St. Louis. He married. He purchased 44 acres of farmland in what is now Overland, Missouri. And believe it or not, some of his descendants in 2021 still live on a portion of that land that he purchased with the money that he got for mustering out of the Army. And they still own and occupy that land. And I think that's a pretty interesting story, too. A lot of we have all kinds of issues now with where people live, the suburbs and et cetera, et cetera. Reed was, of course, the suburb Overland was really farmland, but Reed was one of the earliest, the Reed family was one of the earliest black families to move out to that particular area. Our next person is John G. Buford. Now, John Buford is one of the Buffalo soldiers buried at Greenwood. He was a member of Troop G, 10th United States Cavalry, and he served in both Cuba and the Philippines. Now think about Cuba, because we always hear the story of Teddy Roosevelt and the charge of the Rough Riders, but what they don't tell you is that people like John Buford were at the head of that charge, because Roosevelt sent the black troops up first, I guess to soften things up, or however they put it in the Army, and then he did his famous charge of San Juan Hill. By the 1890s, the African American communities in St. Louis were a home to a variety of black businesses. There were restaurants, grocery stores, laundries, tailor shops, drugstores, photographers, theaters, hotels, seamstresses, hat makers, masseurs, and a tea and coffee merchant. There were contractors, moving and storage companies, dry goods, merchants, morticians, and newspapers. That really tells you, and this was 1890, that tells you something about the growth of the black community, but it also should make you at least think about, why is it that in 1890 all of these types of businesses existed, and in 2021 you're hard put to find any of these things? The next person I'd like for you to meet is a lady called Hattie Hornbeck North. Now she was, I think I missed a page somewhere, because Hattie should be, no. Hattie was associated with at least 4 of the business opportunities that were blossoming in St. Louis. Mrs. North had been born in Canada, and her story is interesting because she is the child of an escaped slave and a white woman. I don't know much about how they met or whatever. I know that the woman actually lived in the same place that Hattie's father did, so perhaps she was an indentured person or something like that, and they both decided to go to Canada. Don't know, but they did have a child, Hattie. Her death certificate lists her occupation as domestic, and she was the iron fist behind the 4 businesses that her daughter and son-in-law owned. Her daughter was Edith North Johnson, and she was a recorded blues singer. Her son-in-law was Jesse Johnson. I don't know if any of you have heard that name, but he was the owner of a group of businesses called Deluxe Enterprises. There were 4 businesses, and it included a restaurant, a music store, and a recording studio, and a cab company. Jesse lived between 1883 and 1946, so we're still talking 100 years ago, and we're talking success. Now, I want to just drop back about Hattie. I told you she was born in Canada, a child of a mixed marriage, and she came to St. Louis under some unusual circumstances. In 1904, there was a really big event going in St. Louis, and I bet you guys know what that is. And if you don't, I'll tell you, it was the World's Fair. Word went out all across the United States. Word went out to other countries that there was a lot of work in St. Louis because of this huge fair that was going to be taking place. That's why Hattie happened to come to St. Louis. She came to St. Louis for work. She met a man named Peter North, married, and simply stayed here. Our next person is a man named James Ray. James was also a businessman. He was the owner of both legitimate and illegitimate types of businesses. He was known to be in association with the Jewish mobs that existed in St. Louis at the time, and was said to be so reckless and wild in his ways that people were afraid of him. On the other hand, it was also said, even though James Ray was thought of as a bad man among his associates, and among preachers certainly who would hear or have reason to be associated with him, but he had a tender spot in his heart for women. And he was also known as, he made it clear to everyone who would come into his circle that he was a race man. And that means that while I've never read anything that say that he had difficulties with whites, but his priority, his focus was on his African-American brothers and sisters. He was shot to death at the Falstaff Bar, and after his death, a female associate who had witnessed the whole proceedings wrote a 14-stanza poem describing the incident in great detail. This can be picked up, that poem can be picked up online in some of the old newspapers. It's pretty interesting because of a couple of other stories of those types that took place in St. Louis. I'm sure that you all have heard of Staggerly, and I'm sure that you've heard Frankie and Johnny. That poem was this type of thing. It describes how his death came about. Now, one of the people who may have frequented Mr. Ray's establishments was a man named Lee Shelton. Lee Shelton had a nickname, and that nickname was Stagger Lee. Now, Stagger Lee is another person that you may have heard of. He was the person who shot Billy Lyons in that often repeated old folk song. The backstory is that Lee Shelton shot and killed William Lyons because of a barroom argument on Christmas Eve in 1895. Stagger Lee was really not a nice person. He was a womanizer and in general a mean individual, but he was also just trying to make his way in a hard world. He had no particular skills, he worked menial jobs, and he gambled. At 30 years old, he killed Lyons with a rifle over an argument that began as a political dispute and ended as a fight over the damage that's Lee allegedly caused to Billy Lyons' hat. So if you've ever heard the song or the story, it talks about Stagger Lee taking the hat, and that was the reason for the killing. At any rate, because of that shooting, Lee Shelton, Stagger Lee, was sentenced to 25 years in jail. He was paroled, returned to St. Louis. He opened a tavern, but it must not have been very profitable because he was convicted of robbery a year later and sent back to prison where he died in 1912. We have a lovely headstone that I think we'll be seeing in a bit for Stagger Lee. And the reason that we have this headstone is a group called Killer Blues. This group goes all over the United States placing headstones for people, for blues, jazz musicians, because most often these people ended up in poverty. That was a tough life, and they ended up in poverty. So this Killer Blues organization has made it their mission to go around, find these graves, and erect headstones. So far, they've erected 3 at Greenwood. The rise in resources and wealth in the community in the African-American community was definitely reflected at Greenwood. Greenwood flourished, and by the early 1900s, it had become somewhat of a status symbol to be able to say that the deceased had been buried in his or her family plot at Greenwood. I mean, that was a big deal. You know, that indicated a level of sophistication. It indicated a level of wealth. It indicated a level of pride. These men and women no longer were buried in the city cemeteries, in the potter's fields. I'm trying to put this together because I didn't really write it down, but if your family member was buried in Potter's Field, or if your family member was buried in the city cemetery, you had no control over what was going on around them. You might even lose that particular grave site. The markings were not marked with headstones as are in traditional cemeteries. So to have Greenwood open was just a different level. It was almost as if we had stepped up a level. There was no longer the need for, we were no longer just, as far as death was concerned, no longer just throwaway people. We were people of value, and to prove it, we got this cemetery where we're buried in a beautiful setting, and there are flowers, et cetera, et cetera. Family plots at Greenwood are still evident. I'm hoping that some of you at some point will come out and visit with us, and we can show you some of the things that I'm talking about. Some of these century-old family plots are still evident. Some of them are still very much usable, and they're very typical of the Victorian era. Some of these plots are now in a great deal of disarray, but hopefully, as this mission goes on, we'll be able to restore them so you'll be able to see what a family plot looked like in the 1890s and the early 1900s. It's a little different than what we normally see today as far as cemeteries go. Now, this next slide, well, that's Stagger Lee. I don't know how I got him out of sequence, but that's Stagger Lee, or Lee Shelton. Now, this is a family plot at Greenwood. This is the plot of George Lee Adams. George was only about 16, 17 years old when he died. I've not been able to find what he died of, but at the base of that tall stone, there's an entry that probably was dictated at least by his mom, talking about her beloved son. That plot consisted of the upright that upright pillar, and it sits on a large stone base. Now, this has been re-erected. I was at the cemetery one afternoon, and I heard what I thought was an explosion. I mean, it really right, and I was way far away from this. But what had happened is the top piece had fallen off the base, and it remained that way for several years until we had a group of people come out. Were they Boy Scouts or Mormons?
No, it was both.
Okay, both Boy Scouts and Mormons, and they did the hard work of replacing this stone, which probably weighs about 500 pounds. But it's there, and it gives us an idea of what an old family plot looked like. Also, where those smaller stones are, there would be chains that sort of link through there, and that would sort of form a little fence around the gravesite. Like I said, George was only about 16 or 17 years old when he died, and he too was the youngest and last living of 5 sons. A lot of times, young people didn't fare too well. And this was one of those cases, and I guess his mom must have really missed him because it's a very touching message on the base of that headstone. The next person we're going to meet is this man, and his name was Romeo West. Mr. West was born here in St. Louis to a fairly affluent family. His father died when he was 10. 2 years later, his mother remarried, and Romeo was sent off to boarding school. The school was Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City, Missouri, and this is another place that I think that Greenwood touches history. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lincoln University as it is now, not Lincoln Institute, or how that whole college system came about. That was the first black college in the state of Missouri. But Mr. West excelled at Lincoln. He graduated from there. Actually, he didn't really have any place to go. Once his mother remarried, she also moved out of the city, leaving him pretty much here in Missouri. But he excelled, he graduated, and he became a staff member who, in addition to teaching and holding positions such as librarian, director of athletics, secretary to the president, he was very involved with young people coming into the school system. Professor West's death was as bizarre as his life appeared to be traditional. On the one hand, this man, I mean, he was a member of the Baptist Church. He was a Prince Hall Mason. He was a member of the Knights of Pythias. He was a member of the Odd Fellows, the Grand United Order of Odd Fellows. So his life seemed to be pretty traditional, but his death wasn't. Romeo, like I said, was very involved with young people at the school. In some cases, that did not set too well with other professors who had different ideas of what that separation between student and teacher really should be. And that's pretty much what brought about his death. The headline of the St. Louis Argus newspaper in the week of his death read, "Romeo Allen West killed at Lincoln Institute. President's secretary shot by dining room superintendent in a row over ice cream." Now, this was an interesting research project because when we went back to look at the newspapers, I mean, there it was, just blasted all over the newspapers. It gave us some idea of West's position here in St. Louis, how Romeo was thought of here in St. Louis, and some idea of what may have been going on college campuses. I understand that the professor that shot Mr. West was armed. Romeo West was armed. They came together in a Wild West duel, basically, but the other guy fired first, and West was killed. Blues and jazz musicians are part of the fabric of St. Louis history, and they are also represented at Greenwood. This is Grant Green. I don't know if we've got any jazz guitar people here, but he was born here in St. Louis. He was discovered playing in a St. Louis bar in the late 1950s, and he was recorded by Blue Note Records. Green was a jazz giant performing with the likes of John Coltrane and Joe Henderson. He is said to have influenced Wes Montgomery and George Benson, but while in New York again, playing at an engagement at one of George Benson's clubs, Green collapsed of a heart attack and was brought back to St. Louis for burial. He was survived by 6 children. This guy is really, he's on the records as a jazz giant, basically. We are so pleased to be able to say that people like this are buried at Greenwood. Now, this next slide is kind of a sad story. These are the Walker children. There's John Walker, age 5, who I think is, let us see now if I can do this. Probably not. Okay. John Walker. That's his brother Elliot on the end, his sister Mabel, and the baby brother Daniel. On Thursday evening, December 27th, 1945, John Walker, Elliot Walker, Mabel Walker, and Daniel Walker were burned to death in a horrible house fire in one of those old St. Louis mansions that had been converted from a home, a single-family home, into a rooming house. Landlords didn't care. All they wanted was the money. And this was a family who had come up from the South, who was not very familiar with cities or city life, and they were just sort of sucked into a bad situation without knowing it. Children were burned beyond recognition, and the deaths were so shocking that the incident was reported not only in the St. Louis Argus, which is the black newspaper. I don't know if you're familiar. Excellent research tool. If you've got something that you need to know, try the Argus first, because more than likely it was reported there. But this situation was so bad that not only did the Argus newspaper report it, so did the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Now, they reported this from different angles. The Post pointed out that the children were alone in their attic apartment, and they were. Mom was working. She was working a night shift as a waitress. Dad had decided that he was going to make a quick trip, I think it was about 2 blocks away, to pick up a radio that was being repaired. While both of them were away, the building just went up in flames. It's thought to have been caused by an old wood-burning stove, and there was just no way to get these children out. Both the Globe mentioned that the stairs to the attic apartment were blocked preventing help getting to the children. But both papers reported that the damages were $15,000 to the building and $300 to the contents, but none of the papers reported that these children, the children's lives had been destroyed. These children's lives had been taken away. It was more important to talk about the value of the dollars than the value of these 4 black children's lives. Only the St. Louis Argus even came close to addressing the real issue, racial and housing discrimination, which the newspapers were calling Jim Crowism. Tensions due to inadequate housing and employment opportunities for blacks in St. Louis were already high. The Walkers were new to St. Louis. The parents moved here from the South seeking a better life for themselves and their children. What they found was low-level, low-paying jobs and services, and they had no alternative but to look for any type of housing that they could find. All the children were buried in one casket, and Greenwood Cemetery provided the children's grave site at no cost. One of the consequences of this particular tragedy was an increased focus on housing and urban renewal. This is thought to be one of the incidents that led to Mill Creek, the Mill Creek area being torn down and revitalized, supposedly. So here again, we've got a situation where even though these are babies, the oldest one is 5 years old, these young people touched history. The deaths of these young people meant that St. Louis would focus on decent housing for people. One of the consequences of the urban renewal projects that came out of the deaths of these children was the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects that were completed and occupied about 10 years after the death of the Walker children. Let's see what I've got here. I've got here I didn't pull up a picture of Pruitt-Igoe, but this slide, well, let me just keep talking and you'll see the value of this slide. In the early days of the Cold War, the United States Army arrived in St. Louis and began spraying chemicals on unsuspecting families and children who lived in and around the Pruitt-Igoe housing project. No one was told anything. The city of St. Louis still, in 2021, maintains that they had no knowledge of what the Army was doing. The Army insisted that the chemicals were harmless, but sprayers were placed on the tops of the buildings and on the backs of motor vehicles. Some were even placed at ground level and chained to lampposts on the playgrounds surrounding Pruitt-Igoe. And then people started to get sick. People started to develop boils and blisters. People began to lose fingernails and toenails. People began to have vision problems. People began to get odd types of cancer. The family of Robert Rogers, whose death certificate this are, in an interview that I did with him years ago, believes that his death was one of the many, many in St. Louis, not just blacks, whites, because you know, once you spray those chemicals, you can't say you can only drift into black neighborhoods. So, you know, near North St. Louis, South St. Louis were both affected by what was going on here. But they believe that his death was a response to this chemical spraying. At the time, he and his family lived in Pruitt-Igoe, and then according to the interview that I did with his daughter, it seemed to the family as if he was healthy one day and dead from pancreatic cancer that had metastasized to his liver within 1 year. And all of this is really evident on this death certificates are another wonderful, wonderful source of information. You know, you see, oh, wait, shoot, okay. You can, I forget it. You can see that under medical certification, his diagnosis of cancer. You can see, well, I don't think I have enough of this copy, but there should be a line down toward the bottom where the medical examiner or his doctor says how long this injury or circumstance had been in effect, and as it turned out, 1 year. 1 year, he had been being treated for 1 year. And there are hundreds of these, not just in Greenwood's burial records, but also in records of other cemeteries. And it's just been recently that people have been willing to accept the fact that this actually did happen right here in the city of St. Louis. The government said, in 1994, the government admitted that it had in fact used St. Louis as a chemical testing ground during the Cold War. And the official reason was St. Louis was architecturally similar to some Soviet cities. So man, we were just sort of picked out of the hat, and a lot of deaths were the result. Now, that is Lucy Delaney, and I'm not sure why she's popping up here either. We might have to come back. I don't know, I'm missing a slide somewhere. What I wanted to talk about is headstones. Okay, let's try this. I'll go back to the other ones. Headstones are a huge resource for Greenwood. For one thing, in a lot of cemeteries, especially as old as Greenwood, a lot of black cemeteries, a lot of poor cemeteries, you don't have a lot of headstones. What you might find is a lot of stones that have been used to mark graves or small monuments. A good example of that is the cemetery out in Kirkwood, a black cemetery out in Kirkwood that was actually dismantled, basically. And what they found was there were very, very few headstones. But when we were working on the National Register, it was estimated that there are as many as 10,000 headstones at Greenwood. And headstones are storytellers. They can tell us a great deal about a person's life. Let's see. Okay, this is the headstone of John Henry Nolan. And the stone, of course, tells his name, J.H. Nolan, his birth date, his death date. The inscription along the bottom says, Big B Chamber, 2466, DeSoto, Missouri. And that indicates a lodge that he belonged to. And his group was called the Big B Chamber. But the story is expanded by the insignia that you can barely see. Let me see if I don't have. Up at the top of that headstone is what makes it important to us. There's an insignia there that indicates that this headstone came from an organization called the Mosaic Templars of America. Now, this was another benevolent association like the Brothers of Friendship and Sisters of the Mysterious Ten. With this particular one, same kind of setup, individuals paid a small fee, usually on a weekly basis. If the person holding the membership became ill, he or she was paid a monthly stipend until they were better. If the person holding the membership died, they were given a headstone like this one. But here in Missouri, we don't see that very often. This organization was basically in the South. So every now and then we'll run across one with the Mosaic Templars. This is priceless to us. You know, not only does it tell us that that the Mosaic Templars were active in the state of Missouri, but it also gives us an opportunity to explore that particular organization. Another good research point if someone was interested. Like the military stones that we're going to probably see a few of in a few minutes, all of these were exactly the same. The stones are frequently seen in Arkansas and Mississippi, not in Missouri, and in African American cemeteries because the organization was an African American organization. Headstones at Greenwood range from 1878 to 1993. There are a wide range of styles and materials. We're very proud of the headstones at Greenwood, actually. Now, this is a marker that was made on site. Greenwood has never been a cemetery that attracted a lot of rich people. These were basically, like I said before, everyday, ordinary folks. Sometimes they couldn't afford the headstones that we normally think of today. At Greenwood, the cemetery owners decided to make a headstone or a grave marker or whatever. We call these planter boxes. I don't know what the real name for it is. But anyway, they made these. Let's see. They made these. So, you know, if you're wandering around and you see something with that little enamel star or an enamel cross, then you know automatically that these were made on site. Another piece of history that is totally, you know, just totally gone by the wayside. So we're really proud of those, that they're still there and still evident. We have simple commercial stones that say very little: name, birth year, death year. We have elaborate commercial stones. That's a beauty. We have picture stones, and the distinguishing thing there is that the person's picture actually appears on the stone itself. Now, a lot of times at Greenwood, we'll see that stone and the picture's missing. But as we've had young volunteers out, you know, who can get out on the ground and just dig around, we've noticed that if they dig close to the front of that headstone, they'll frequently find that picture. So some of these headstones, even though they go back a ways, we've been able to replace the pictures and preserve that person's piece of history, which is their face. Now, we have headstones that reflect African American burial traditions, and this is one of them. All of those little things that are buried in that grave marker there are conch shells. This person was probably from the South. This probably had been a part of his burial tradition for years and years and years. So when he died, his family enclosed that grave and then embedded the conch shells in there. I'm sorry to say that I really don't know the meaning of the conch shells, but I've seen that many times, especially in the South. Another African American burial tradition that we pick up at Greenwood is this gravel. This family filled the middle of their planter box with white gravel and also sprinkled gravel around the side. There's nothing really mysterious about that. The gravel kept down the weeds. And so that, you know, that just became, and I guess somebody at some point thought that it was attractive, and it became a part of burial history. Now we have military stones, tons of them. We have military people buried at Greenwood, and they served from the Civil War through Vietnam. So we have plenty of different kinds of military stones. And once again, you know, when you really think about it, we hear or have heard on occasion that blacks didn't honor military service or were not inclined toward military service. Greenwood really disproves that. This guy entered the Army in 1865, but like I say, we go all the way from the Civil War to Vietnam, so there's the idea that military service was not honored is nonsense. Now I think this is, okay, we have what we call secondary use headstones. This is marking a grave. It is not a traditional headstone. We think what it is a piece of a building. You know, the molding, and we think that that's exactly what this is, and somebody reclaimed it and used it to mark a grave. We've been for several years trying to figure out who's buried there because we don't know. I think I've jumped over a whole section. Because we can now take our burial records, and as Raphael cleans the area that this one is located in, what we'll do is we'll look at all of the other headstones that are around it. We'll look at the empty spaces. Shelley has a background that allows her to understand the measurements. And so eventually, you know, we do that row by row by row, and eventually we'll narrow down the name of the person that's buried here. Our burial records were set up in an Excel format, and that was because it was my responsibility to begin the process of digitizing those records, and I worked in an industry that we used Excel all the time. Turns out it was not a bad idea at all, because when our burial records are set up so that we can sort by a person's last name or their first name or their death date or their birth date, or sometimes we can also just sort by their occupation, and all of those things come together to give an idea of what the African American community was like. This is another secondary use headstone. Now, we think that what this is the bottom of a fast food restaurant bench. We had been working at the cemetery for a while, and we came one Saturday morning, and this was just there. So we don't know where it came from or when it came. It had to be sometime during the week. We left on Saturday and came back the next Saturday, and this was there. But we really do think that this is what this was, the bottom of a bench. Somebody decided it would make a wonderful grave marker, and it's there. We won't remove it. We'll just leave it just like it is. I think it's ugly, but it's there. We also have a lot of handmade headstones, and these are my favorites. I tell you, this is D.J. Perkins, somebody's daughter, and she was born in 47, died in 60. But all over the grounds, we have these little treasures. These, once again, point to a time when a lot of African Americans may not have been able to afford a regular commercial headstone. So somebody's pop probably got out there with some cement and a mold, and their daughter is forever honored. Let's see now. This is my very favorite and the last of my headstones. This is a headstone that is being consumed by a tree. This is how the headstone looked when I first saw it. It was sort of, wedged in that tree. About 15 years later, this is what the headstone looked like. Now, if we would bring you to Greenwood today, you'd see a tree. Even that tiny, tiny, tiny little space is gone. Fortunately, we know who the person is, and if we could ever locate some family, we can request that the government send us a new headstone, and it will be placed there. But I think that's an awesome example of the power of Mother Nature. So, in 1999, all the burial records from 1907 to 1939 were missing. Apparently, they were lost. The records that we did have were copies of copies. There were no deed books, no business records, no cemetery registers, no lot owners' records, and no section descriptions. Very few plat maps. So basically, Greenwood was a giant puzzle. And it has been our responsibility since 1999 to gather enough information to solve that puzzle, and that's what research does for us. Let's see. Okay.
Well, our time has ended. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you, everyone. No, we are. Thank you to Dr. Grace Moser and St. Charles Community College. We appreciate your coming to listen to us. If you guys ever want to come and visit us at Greenwood, we welcome you. We're located at 6571 St. Louis Avenue in Hillsdale. So please, and if you have any questions, we'll be around for a while. Thank you so much. Have a great day.